these copycat guns better than the originals? The AK-47. What do you get when you cross an experimental German weapon and the most legendary American military rifle? The most ubiquitous firearm ever created. If an argument can be made for the single most successful firearm of all time, it would be the AK-47 and its derivatives. Reliable, cheap, and easy to produce, there have been over 100 million AKs of some kind or the other produced, with more being made to this day. It was designed in 1947 by Soviet engineer Mikhail Kalashnikov, who drew inspiration from other firearms from the Second World War, and officially adopted by the Soviet Union in 1949. At first glance, the obvious inspiration would be the German STG-44, widely considered to be the first mass-production assault rifle. The profile of both weapons is very similar, and both utilize intermediate cartridges. The overall design and production methods inspired by German engineers who were sent to the Soviet Union after the war, including several who were involved in the STG-44's development. In spite of the cosmetic similarities, there's another firearm that allegedly inspired the AK-47 much more than the STG-44, the M1 Garand. Kalashnikov himself stated that he based a significant portion of the AK-47's design on the American semi-automatic rifle. These parts included the rotating bolt, the trigger group, which was much more simple than the STG-44's trigger mechanism, and the long-stroke gas piston, compared to the short piston design that was common in other Soviet rifles such as the SKS. There's a great deal of debate as to how much the STG-44 and the M1 influenced the design of the AK-47, whether design elements were borrowed, copied completely, or simply coincidental. That said, it's got the best features of both, and then some. It's much simpler and easier to produce than the STG and has more firepower than the M1. Its reliability is legendary. It's able to withstand even the most harsh conditions with little, if any, maintenance. Oh, and it won't give you the dreaded Garand thumb either. The M1917. During the First World War, the British were in need of rifles for the influx of new recruits, especially the pattern 14 Enfield. To keep up with the demand, they turned to several American companies like Winchester and Remington to meet the need. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the standard rifle was the Springfield M1903, chambered in .30-06. Like the British, there were simply not enough to go around, and the firearm manufacturer Springfield didn't have the ability to equip the flood of recruits. Other manufacturers were contracted to make rifles for the doughboys, but it would be too difficult to convert these factories to produce enough M1903s to meet the demand. It was here that a simple solution was devised. It was simply to take the pattern 14 Enfield, chambered in .303, and convert it to fire the .30-06 cartridge. The resulting rifle was designated the M1917 Enfield. Because of the differences in cartridge, the M1917 has an important advantage over its British predecessor, a larger magazine capacity, able to hold 6 rounds as opposed to the 5-round magazine of the pattern 14. Likewise, the other differences in performance are based on the ammunition used. The .30-06 is a more powerful round, meaning that the M1917 has a muzzle velocity of around 2,700 feet per second, compared to the 2,380 feet per second of the pattern 14. Though it couldn't actually fire the round properly, the M1917 could handle the discharge of a .303 round in its chamber without too much damage occurring, should the wrong round be used. In contrast, the pattern 14 couldn't handle a .30-06 discharge without being put out of action. This, of course, is an extremely rare occurrence and would almost never happen outside of exceptional circumstances. This isn't to say that the pattern 14 or the .303 cartridge is a poorly designed weapon. On the contrary, it served reliably in the trenches, and it was an asset to those who wielded it, though it was edged out in performance by a copy made out of desperation. The M1903. When the United States went to war in 1917, their standard-issue firearm was the bolt-action M1903 Springfield. In an ironic twist of fate, their primary enemy was the German military, who equipped all their soldiers with the Gewehr 98, whose design was the inspiration for their own weapon. Designed by legendary German gunmaker Paul Mauser, the Gewehr 98 was adopted by the German military and achieved immediate success. Other firearm manufacturers copied the rifle, the most famous being American Springfield Armory, who would eventually create the M1903. In another ironic twist, the motivation to develop the M1903 came about after American troops were outclassed by Spanish soldiers who wielded the Mauser M1893, a predecessor of the M98, while Americans used the Krag-Jorgensen rifle, which was less powerful and had a cumbersome reloading mechanism. The first prototype was tested in 1900 and greatly impressed the U.S. Army Ordnance Board, who generally approved of the new rifle. After a few more years of testing and some additional tweaks to the design, it was finally approved in June of 1903. Though based on the Mauser, the M1903 has some key differences. It was chambered in .30-06 rather than 7.92 by 57mm. It also had a two-part firing pin rather than the single Mauser pin, a second lug at the rear of the bolt mechanism, and a knob that allowed the weapon to be cocked without the bolt having to be worked. Other than these and a few other minor changes, it was, for all practical purposes, a clone of the Mauser. The design of the M1903 was so similar to the Gewehr 98 that Paul Mauser actually sued the US government for copyright infringement. There are some anecdotes that the Americans actually paid the royalties to Mauser during the war, though this is inaccurate. As a settlement for the dispute, it was agreed that the US would pay 75 cents per rifle made and 50 cents for every 1,000 loading clips. In total, the amount paid was an estimated $200,000, though this was paid off in several installments that ended in 1909. The Bren. After the First World War, the British military was in need of a general-purpose replacement for both the Lewis light machine gun and the heavy Vickers. After testing many other weapons, one machine gun that caught their attention more than the others was the Czech ZB VZ-26. First made in 1924, the ZB VZ-26 was an air-cooled light machine gun, which made it much lighter than the water-cooled Vickers, and it was also light enough to be carried by one person. It was also much more reliable than the Lewis gun. Although they were impressed by the design, the British military still needed some modifications to the gun before they could adopt it themselves. The first change was rechambering the 7.92 by 57mm ZB-26 to British standard .303. The most iconic feature, the top-mounted magazine, was changed from a 20-round straight magazine to a curved magazine that could hold 30 rounds. This new version, called the ZB-30, was tested by the British military, and after a few more changes, was redesignated the ZGB and entered service in the British military. The name Bren is a combination of Brno, the Czech town where they were manufactured, and Enfield, the British firearm maker. The Bren gun became the primary light machine gun used by British forces during the Second World War, gaining a reputation for reliability and ease of operation. There were 4 different versions of the Bren made, though the only significant difference between the versions was making the weapon shorter or lighter. Most of the production of the Bren was shifted to Canada, where another version, chambered in 7.92mm, was sent to Chinese nationalist forces. In addition to the Bren, the ZB-26 inspired other firearms, one of which included the Japanese Type 97 tank machine gun, which was mounted on Japanese tanks and other vehicles, an additional legacy to an often overlooked firearm. If there's one thing the firearm world is known for, it would be copying the work of another. These are just a few examples of when the copy of a firearm has advantages over the original.